Today is June 4th, 2022. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I want to start by taking a look at the map as usual. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map, so keep that in mind when we look at it. And as you can see along the line of contact, it is relatively calm. Most of the fighting, which is usual, is in the Donbas region, and we can see fighting continuing around Avdiivka. This is a major fortified city being encircled by Russian forces. We can see beyond Bakhmut, which is now fully under Russian control, we can see fighting taking place, stretching out perhaps an encirclement of Chasiv Yar and beyond. And I just want to point out where Belgorod is on the map. So Belgorod is across from Kharkov. This is the city, and we remember last week all of these incursions across the border by Ukrainian forces. I want to get into that first. I want to talk about some of the things that the Western media reported but really didn't emphasize, but which were, I think, the most important factors regarding these cross-border incursions. Usually the Western media will have one single narrative. They will all tell the same story, the same points will be emphasized, but in this case, no. And I think what this represents is the deterioration of the situation in Ukraine. So let's take a look at how the Western media reported this. Let's start with this from Newsweek. Troops cross into Russia as Putin's army fights to defend Belgorod. Report, and this was from June 1st, 2023. The article says, Russian fighters serving under the Ukrainian armed forces have crossed into Russia's Belgorod region, bringing heavy equipment with them. Ilya Ponomorov, an exiled Russian politician who says he is the political representative of the group of fighters, told Newsweek. So the representatives of these militants was in direct contact with Newsweek. Keep that in mind as we dig into who these militants actually are. The Newsweek article also says the Freedom of Russia Legion, formed weeks after Russia's invasion of Ukraine began in February 22, and made up of defectors from the Russian armed forces and Russian and Belarusian volunteers. And the Russian Volunteer Corps published videos on their social media channels claiming to be near or in Shebenkino on Thursday morning. This is outside of Belgorod. They never reached the actual city of Belgorod. Now, if you're observant and you looked at these militants, you would have noticed immediately that they're all overtly Nazis. They're Nazis. And Newsweek doesn't mention the word Nazi even one time, doesn't talk at all about their ideology, but others in the Western media did, like this from NBC News. This is US media, mainstream media. Who are the anti-Putin groups behind the dramatic raid into Russia? And they do have a video here, and it's Denis Kapustin. He is the leader, or one of the leaders, supposed leaders of this group. You can see a Nazi black sun on this one's uniform, and you can see their made-up symbol, all of it very fascistic, and of course Rex on his hat. He is the creator of White Rex, which is a Nazi clothing brand, And this has been around for a while, and the Western media has talked about it in the past, and even academic papers have talked about this in the past. Western and US, more specifically US-based academic papers. First, let's see what NBC News has to say about this, because they're going to tell a slightly different story than Newsweek. Newsweek is portraying these heroic Russians who are siding with the Ukrainians and fighting to liberate Russia from Putin's rule. NBC News is going to bring things back down to earth a little here. It says, who are the anti-Putin groups behind the dramatic raid into Russia? Two militant groups with neo-Nazi ties have emerged from relative obscurity to claim responsibility for the Belgorod attack, taunt the Kremlin, and promise more to come. The article says, the Belgorod border raid has thrust two groups of largely unknown fighters with neo-Nazi ties into the heart of the conflict. Russia has blamed the attack on Kiev, but Ukraine has denied any involvement, which is ridiculous because they're using tanks, armored personnel carriers, and heavy weapons, including weapons provided by NATO. And I'll get into emissions of that across the Western media as well. It says the Russian Volunteer Corps, or RVC, says it's made up of Russians fighting on Ukraine's side and against Putin's government. The group made headlines in March when it claimed to be behind a smaller raid in the Bryansk region. Its commander, Denis Kapustin, who also goes by the last name of Nikitin, is a white nationalist ex-soccer hooligan who shares neo-Nazi views. He is a Nazi. He's a Nazi, and he fits right in with all the other Nazis infesting Ukraine's government and military. Kapustin is listed on Russia's federal wanted list and its register of extremists and terrorists. So at least one nation in the world recognizes them as Nazis, as the overt Nazis they are, as the overt Nazis NBC News admits they are, and is punishing them accordingly. As I'm going to get into here in just a moment, the Ukrainian government and with their Western sponsors are arming and equipping them and encouraging them to do this. The US-based Anti-Defamation League has described Kapustin as a Russian neo-Nazi who lived in Germany for many years and who goes by the call sign White Rex and reportedly founded a clothing brand of the same name that is popular among Russian neo-Nazis. And as you can see, the Russian government puts these people on extremist lists. They don't encourage this. They do not support this, unlike the Ukrainian government, who's giving them tanks, APCs, anti-tank rockets, and small arms. Now, I talked about academic papers, and I want to draw people's attention to this. This was shared to me by a friend who pointed this out. This is a U.S. Naval Postgraduate School thesis from 2022. This is a .mil website, and it's about soccer hooligans to MMA, the changing face of the radical right through sports. And if you go to the table of contents, it will talk about White Rex specifically. And the paper says, under a section titled "The Development of White Rex and the Pan-European Radical Right in MMA." When they say radical right, they're talking about Nazis. A prominent example of this trans-European radical right movement is the development of the neo-Nazi combat clothing brand and MMA promotion, White Rex. And this was thriving in Europe. And he was not in Russia, he was in Europe, because this is against the law in Russia. White Rex was established in 2008 by Russian soccer hooligan turned entrepreneur Denis Kapustin. He was the one in the video on NBC News's article there. Known better by his alias Denis Nikitin. The official website touts, White Rex is a Russian mixed martial arts promotion, aggressive clothing and sports gear company that advocates pan-European pride and traditional values. White Rex encourages all Europeans to embrace the warrior spirit of their ancestors and fight back against the modern world. Just the type of extremist who would be glad to go on a suicide mission into Russia's Belgorod region. The name White Rex stands for white, heterosexual, reactionary, xenophobe, and the clothing the brand sells is full of neo-Nazi symbolism, glorification of violence, and warrior crusader imagery, which we are told does not exist in Ukraine, and yet we see the Ukrainian government clearly sponsoring these Nazis and providing them material support to kill people across the border with Russia. In essence, White Rex advocates for white supremacist, radical right values and shuns what its leadership perceives as the decadence, weakness, and liberalism of the current world order, with a strong undercurrent of replacement theory. Denis Kapustin used White Rex to create a pan-European neo-Nazi movement and now military organization, military unit within Ukraine's armed forces, right alongside Azov, who are also overt Nazis and officially a military unit within Ukraine's armed forces. He does not just make shirts that have neo-Nazi slogans and advocate ethnic violence, but rather he created an all-encompassing lifestyle brand to promote to and among pan-European neo-Nazi ideology. Now he leads an armed military unit that is killing people. Now, if you read all of these articles, Newsweek, NBC News, I'm going to show you a Washington Post and also CNN article about all of this. They try to put distance between these overt Nazis and Kiev and also, obviously, Kiev's Western backers. But of course, they could not have done this without Western support. And so here is a Washington Post article. Use of NATO arms for attack in Russia raises doubts about Kiev's control. So they're trying to make it out as if, oops, somehow a bunch of tanks got into the hands of these Nazis. We don't know how that happens. But of course, we do know how that happens. It's the same way it happens with Azov. It's very, very deliberate. The Washington Post article says the Russian fighters lined against Moscow who launched cross-border raid from Ukraine into Belgorod region of Russia last week used at least 4 tactical vehicles originally given to Ukraine by the United States and Poland, U.S. officials said, raising questions about the unintended use of NATO-provided equipment and Kiev's commitments to secure material supplied by its supporters. Where have we heard this before? We've heard this regarding the so-called moderate rebels in Syria, who all turned out to be Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now we see this developing in Ukraine, where these are supposedly patriots, freedom fighters. Actually, they're Nazis, and this is who the U.S. has been backing since 2014 when they overthrew the elected government of Ukraine during the Maidan protests. Then the Washington Post gets into the details. 3 of the mine resistance ambush protected vehicles, also known as MRAPs, taken into Russia by the fighters were provided by the United States, and the 4th was from Poland, according to people familiar with the U.S. intelligence findings, which has not previously been reported. Those people spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss the sensitive issue. The fighters also carried rifles made by Belgium and the Czech Republic, and at least 1 AT-4 anti-tank weapon in common use among U.S. and Western troops, according to photos verified by the Washington Post. U.S. and Western officials have insisted that Ukraine carefully track the billions of dollars worth of weapons that have flowed into the country. Kiev's backers have also largely barred Ukrainian forces from using Western weapons and equipment for attacks on Russian soil. Yet the recent raid into Russia underscores how material can change hands in unpredictable ways. It's not unpredictable at all. Everyone predicted this would happen. And this is if you're going to pretend that these Nazis aren't under the direct command of Kiev. They are. They obviously are. At least 2 MRAPs appear to have been captured by Russian forces after the operation, according to imagery examined by the Post. And many others have done a very good job pulling apart the tactical aspects of these cross-border raids. The Washington Post also admits that these militants, at least they admit it includes Nazis, although this is very obviously a Nazi military unit within Ukraine's armed forces. It says the Legion of Free Russia and a second militia called the Russian Volunteer Corps led the raid. The groups are composed of ethnic Russian fighters, including Russian citizens who oppose Russian President Vladimir Putin, say they are working to liberate their homeland. Some of the members of the groups are known to be Russian neo-Nazis or to harbor other extremist views. Why is it, if this conflict in Ukraine is about evil Russia invading Ukraine, why is it that the Russian volunteers also happen to be Nazis who are fighting back against the rest of Russia with Ukrainian and NATO weapons, provided weapons? Why is that the case? Why aren't there democratically principled Russians fighting back, carrying out this cross-border raid? It's because the very nature of this conflict is exactly as Moscow said when it launched its special military operation. That's what this cross-border raid does. It does several things, but the main thing it does is vindicate Moscow and justify the special military operation. Ukraine clearly has a Nazi problem that it either deliberately fuels or cannot control. If you want to believe the Washington Post, they can't control it. That means the problem is so big they can't control it, and tanks and APCs and anti-tank rockets are falling into the hands of Nazis. That sounds like a very big problem. That sounds like a justified national security concern for Russia. Now, why is Ukraine sending these Nazis into Russia to attack small villages outside of the city of Belgorod? Why are they doing that? Does Ukraine have weapons, vehicles, ammunition to spare to do this? Or is this desperation? Is this the transition from open combat on the field of battle to a campaign of terrorism, which would indicate Ukraine losing significantly? Here's another piece from the Washington Post. Actually says Bloomberg here. Ukraine's attacks on Russia are a calculated gamble. I don't think that you would carry out an attack like this if, as say U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken recently said, Russia's military is suffering, Ukraine's military is more powerful and is winning. I don't think you would carry out something like this if you are winning. Russia surely is not doing anything like this. They don't need to. It says, firstly, such feints forced the Russian command to consider the many vulnerabilities of Russia's vast territory. In the Belgorod region, the Ukrainian group, apparently led by renegade Russians, struck at a place where a newly and expensively fortified stretch of the border ended. Any border post was barely manned. The fighters seized control of 3 sleepy villages and hoisted a Ukrainian flag on top of a social club before being driven back. The drones that reached Moscow penetrated the tightest air defenses in all of Russia simply because they flew low and apparently didn't use satellite navigation on the approach. Even Putin recognized that Moscow's air defenses need work, although clearly they did work. He thinks they should have worked better. The upshot then is that the Russian military command must divert forces and attention from the front line in Ukraine, and that's a help to the Ukrainian command as it seeks to confuse the enemy about the direction or directions of the pending counteroffensive. But no, not really. Russia is a vast country with a large population. They have more than enough resources to marshal security forces within Russia to protect places like Belgorod. They do not have to take anything off the front line. As a matter of fact, they can continue building up their forces on the front line while they secure these holes in their defenses in places like Belgorod. The article continues. It says, secondly, the attacks are useful in Ukraine's sophisticated information warfare. They have eased any negative publicity that could have arisen from the surrender of Bakhmut, a town which Ukraine expended considerable resources to defend and then lost after saying they wouldn't lose it. They have also successfully tested the attitudes of Ukraine's Western allies toward more daring Ukrainian actions. The official US and UK reactions have been calm. The resolve of Western nations to supply Ukraine with longer-range missiles, such as the UK's Storm Shadow and warplanes such as the F-16, have not noticeably wavered, even though Ukraine is allowing weapons that the US and its NATO allies have provided them to fall into the hands of actual Nazis. And that's essentially what this article is admitting, that we just watched Nazis from Ukraine cross over into Russia with NATO weapons, and NATO seems okay with that. There's no consequences at all whatsoever. They're also admitting that Ukraine is losing strategically. They don't say it directly, but they just admitted Ukraine lost Bakhmut, an entire city that had been heavily fortified. They invested huge amounts of men and equipment to try to hold. They failed. They have been pushed out of Bakhmut. Russia now fully controls that city, and now they're pushing beyond Bakhmut. That is a tactical and strategic defeat for Ukraine. And what are they doing to address it? Are they trying to solve the problems that allowed Bakhmut to be taken from them in the first place? No, they're countering it with information warfare. In other words, smoke and mirrors to cover up for the fact that they cannot make anything happen on the actual battlefield. They're going to send these groups of Nazi extremists across the border to stir up trouble, superficial trouble in Belgorod, in a way that will not change anything tactically or strategically. Then there's an article from CNN. Ukraine's cross-border tactics are aimed at destabilizing Russia. Judging by the response, they're working. Now that's a big claim. Let's see what CNN is even talking about. Ukraine has opened a new front in its battle to drive out the Russian invader in Russia. But it is oddly coy about admitting that it has sent troops, fired artillery, and flown drones into its neighbor's territory. The operations of Russian citizens carrying Ukrainian military ID, wearing Ukrainian uniforms, and attacking from Ukraine remain officially opaque. It is Kiev's contribution to what's become known as hybrid warfare in the gray zone of contemporary conflict. This is them just basically admitting, yes, Kiev organized this from A to Z, and they just have these Russian Nazis hiding in Ukraine because they're labeled terrorists in Russia. They just use them as the face for this operation. It says the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom for Russia Legion, which fall under Ukraine's defense intelligence structure, there you go, they're just admitting it, have been conducting short cross-border raids into Russia. The principal aim? Destabilization. In Ukraine, it suits Kiev to have Russians invade Russia on its behalf. The tactical results may be limited. They just admitted that they're not actually, it's not really Russians. It's just a Russian face to a Ukrainian military operation. Brief incursions into small border villages, but the desired effect of destabilization in Russia is achieved. Russian TV has been awash in breathless and terrified reports by local journalists on the artillery attacks against Russian towns. The problem with this is that there is no real infighting. The only argument inside Russia right now is whether or not to escalate and expand Russian military operations against Ukraine. That does not benefit Ukraine at all. What they're doing is further unifying the Russian population. They're vindicating and justifying everything that Russia has done up to this point from February 2022. They said, we have to go into Ukraine because it's infested with Nazis who pose a threat to us. Now Nazis with NATO weapons have crossed over into Russian territory. For the Russian population, it's case closed. It's very clear that what they were told was true and that the threat is real. This is about covering up desperation. This is about Washington Post, CNN, and many others spinning what is an act of desperation. We just heard U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in Finland. He reused this old tired joke about how Russia said it was the second largest military in the world, and now everyone can see it's only the second largest military in Ukraine. Russia didn't just lose an entire city, Ukraine did. And it's not Russia begging for additional warplanes and tanks. It's Ukraine that's doing that. It's not Russia that's out of air defense missiles. It is Ukraine. Now, I'm going to get into some of that here in just a moment. Also, what we're seeing, what I believe what we're seeing here is the transition from open warfare on the battlefield to a campaign of terrorism. Very similar to what happened with the United States. The United States illegally invaded Iraq on a false pretense. The Iraqi forces attempted to fight and defend their country against invading US forces. They failed on the battlefield, so they had to resort to guerrilla warfare, insurrection tactics, hit and run, bombings, assassinations, and then of course the elements of Al-Qaeda and ISIS were eventually introduced, and they did conduct outright terror, and not necessarily to fight against the United States, but to just divide the growing opposition to the US occupation. The point here is that if you cannot fight a conventional war on the field of battle, you switch to unconventional methods. Ukraine is using a combination of terrorist bombings, assassinations, these drone attacks, which really achieve nothing at all strategically, tactically, or even psychologically when you really think about it. And this is what Russian commanders have said about the attacks. They don't even achieve anything psychologically, because all it does is make Russian people more angry with Ukraine and more determined to support their own government in terms of the special military operations. They achieve absolutely nothing at all. But they're doing this because they cannot do anything on the field of battle. We're waiting for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. There may still be certain achievements they're able to make with that, but they, as I said, will be limited no matter where the offensive ends on the map, no matter how much territory they take. At the end of it, they will be exhausted in terms of manpower, equipment, and ammunition, and these are all things the West is incapable of replacing at this point. So that's what this is. This is a transition from conventional warfare to unconventional tactics, including terrorism. That is what this actually is. It is a sign of desperation. It is not a sign of Ukraine's growing military prowess. It is not a sign of Ukrainian success. It is a sign of what Ukraine is trying to substitute for success. Now let's talk about this as a war of attrition and why Ukraine is resorting to increasingly desperate tactics. I want to go over this new security assistance package announced by the Pentagon at the very end of last month, May 31st. But before that, I just want to remind people that this is indeed a war of attrition. Ukraine and its Western sponsors are clearly losing it. Russia has a much larger military-industrial output than the collective West has, and their whole approach to this conflict has been to grind down Ukrainian forces, not take territory, not seize cities, but to grind down Ukrainian forces, to draw in NATO equipment and ammunition and destroy it at a pace faster than NATO can replace it. Just for an example, we have this. I've gone over this article before. This was from May 19th. Europe's military-industrial capabilities fall short of Ukraine's needs. This is from the Washington Post. Just in title alone, they're admitting this. And they address artillery shell production. Specifically, it says signs are emerging of a parallel effort in Russia to increase production despite Western sanctions. Data recently published on Russia's Federal Treasury website showed Moscow spent 2 trillion rubles, about $26 billion, on defense in January and February alone, a 282% increase over the same period in 2021, Reuters reported. Russia is on course to produce 2.5 million artillery shell rounds this year, up from 1.7 million before the war started. 2.5 million rounds this year. The US and Europe combined are working on expanding their shell production. In 2 or 3 years' time, they hope to be producing at least 1 million rounds a year. So that will be 2 million rounds collectively in 2 to 3 years. Russia is making 2.5 million rounds right now, and that's if that number is even correct, and it's not even higher. So let's talk about this more recent security assistance package from the U.S. Department of Defense, May 31st, 2023. Again, here's the list, and I'm going to go over these in detail. So the first on the list is additional munitions for Patriot air defense system. I bet they have to send more Patriot missiles to Ukraine. We saw the video of Kiev-based Patriot missile systems firing over 30 missiles in just 2 minutes. Lockheed Martin only makes 300 missiles a year for all of its global customers. That is 10% of Lockheed's annual production gone in 2 minutes. So yes, obviously they're going to need to send more missiles to Ukraine. And this is an example of how this is a war of attrition and Russia is winning it. Next is AIM-7 missiles for air defense. Now, AIM-7 is usually an air-to-air missile. There's a naval variant. RIM-7 is fired from a launcher based on a ship. And there's actually an article. This is a Ukrainian Defense Express. This is a Ukrainian source. U.S. says it now sends AIM-7 to Ukraine, but how will it work? And it says the latest military aid package for Ukraine announced on May 31st by the U.S. DoD once again raises interesting questions. Among the already familiar supplies of artillery and tank ammunition, there's a mystery hiding named AIM-7 missiles for air defense. On one hand, there has already been the announcement of the United States giving Ukraine RIM-7 missiles, known as the Sea Sparrow, in an earlier package from January 6th. This is a sea-launched variant of the AIM-7, and there was information that it would be integrated into the land-based Buk missile system of Soviet manufacture. So I've talked about the Buk air defense system created by the Soviet Union. Ukraine had a large number of these. They're running out of missiles. The U.S. is using RIM-7 missiles to replace those missiles from Ukraine's stockpiles because they cannot make any more. And there was a plan to convert these RIM-7 missiles for use on Buk launchers. This was being done by Eastern European NATO members before the special military operation began. And there's a question of how successful this conversion was. So we'll just have to keep an eye on that and see what happens with these AIM-7 missiles. They've already sent the RIM-7 missiles for use on the Buk launchers. I haven't heard any news at all about how successful that was. If it was really successful, I think we would have heard about it. If these are being used for air-to-air combat, being fitted on, say, Soviet-era warplanes that Ukraine still has on hand, they're already using the Storm Shadow mounted on Soviet-era warplanes. They've got the HARM, the anti-radiation missile, supposedly being fired by Soviet-era warplanes that Ukraine possesses. Could they be putting these missiles, RIM-7 air-to-air missiles, on Soviet-era warplanes that Ukraine still has? They don't have a lot of these warplanes. Even if they are, the AIM-7 has a very short range compared to the air-to-air missiles Russia is using. So again, it's not going to make any difference. It's not going to help Ukraine, whether it's for the Buk launcher or if it's for Soviet-era warplanes that Ukraine has. It's not going to make any difference. The Buk launchers, because depending on what type of AIM-7 or RIM-7 missile that was provided, some of them have a range comparable to the Buk systems interceptors. Some of them have a shorter range. But either way, it doesn't matter because Russian warplanes are using these glide bombs, which allow them to hit targets along the line of contact without ever coming into range of Buk launchers, no matter what missile they're firing. Next is Avenger air defense system and Stinger anti-aircraft system. So essentially the Avenger system is are Stinger missile launchers mounted on a Humvee. They have some additional fire control systems. They have a gun to augment the missiles, but essentially it is a short-range air defense system, and again, is not going to help along the line of contact where Russian military aviation are using these glide bombs. It's well out of the range of any sort of Stinger missile. It also says additional ammunition for high mobility artillery rocket system, HIMARS. Well, we haven't heard much about HIMARS recently, have we? The last thing we heard about HIMARS actually came from CNN, and it said Russia's jamming of US provided rocket systems complicates Ukraine's war effort. Notice how they don't even want to use the word HIMARS in the headline, because they're hoping you don't read down here and realize that, yes, they're talking about HIMARS, the wonder weapon that was supposed to change the game, tilt the battle in Ukraine's favor. Well, now they're being jammed by Russian forces, and they're having a real hard time countering Russian jamming efforts. That article will be in the video description below for anyone who missed it. It says 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds. I was just talking about how Russia is producing many times more artillery rounds than the US and Europe combined. They're talking about 105 millimeter artillery rounds because they didn't have enough 155 millimeter rounds or guns to fire them. So they started giving Ukraine 105 millimeter systems and ammunition as well. It also says 105 millimeter tank ammunition. Now, modern Western main battle tanks use 120 millimeter rounds. Russian main battle tanks use 125 millimeter rounds. So when they're talking about 105 millimeter rounds, they're talking about light tanks and older tanks like the Leopard 1 that use 105 millimeter rounds. This is for the antiquated tanks that they sent Ukraine instead of the modern tanks that Ukraine was begging for. Precision aerial munitions, there's really no description of what that is. It would be used on whatever remaining warplanes Ukraine has. And again, Ukrainian warplanes face so many threats from being destroyed on the ground before they even take off, from being downed by air defense systems, or being shot down by Russian warplanes, which are not in short supply. So the difference that precision aerial munitions will make in Ukraine's hands is negligible. Zuni aircraft rockets. Well, these are being used on a few different platforms. There's this article from Drive. The Drive, evidence of American Zuni rockets arming Ukrainian Su-25s emerges. Su-25s, Ukraine has a handful of these. They put them in rocket launchers. They're unguided. America has a large number of these. They don't use them anymore because they use precision guided weapons instead. They could also potentially be used on Soviet-era helicopters that Ukraine may still have on hand. And you can see images of Zuni rockets being used by the US. These are on Vietnam-era warplanes. They have not used these anytime recently. And Zuni rockets are being sent to Ukraine because they're out of their own rockets, and there's nothing more effective that the US has that they can send Ukraine. Munitions for unmanned aerial systems, there's no explanation for that. That could mean almost anything. AT-4 anti-armor systems, these are older, less effective anti-tank weapons being sent to Ukraine because they're out of Javelin and tow missiles. They've already sent about as many of those as they can without completely exhausting Western stockpiles. Then it says over 30 million rounds of small arms ammunition. Wow, that sounds like a lot. But then again, you have to remember that the average Ukrainian brigade is made up of about 4,000 men. That's 7,500 rounds per man. Typical infantryman carries around 210 in a full loadout. So that's about 35 full loads. And as I've explained many times before, in modern warfare, it's not one shot, one kill. You're spraying hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of rounds, usually in the form of suppression fire. Very, very few of these rounds are actually used to kill enemy combatants. Many of the times you're just trying to keep the enemy's head down so that you can use artillery, mortars, grenades, and other indirect fire weapons to kill the enemy. 30 million rounds sounds like a lot, but when you really think about it, it isn't. And then they also list mine clearing equipment and systems, demolition munitions for obstacle clearing, night vision devices, spare parts, generators, and other field equipment, which obviously is all very necessary, but these are not game-changing systems that Russia doesn't already have in much greater quantities. And what is all of this for? Obviously, this is to help maintain Ukraine's existing defense capabilities. Some of it might be for the upcoming offensive, but I just want to point out this article from Voice of America, which is US government-funded media. US tanks, F-16s part of long-term aid for Ukraine, not upcoming offensive. And it says America's top military officer says training for Ukrainian forces on advanced US Abrams tanks has started, but those weapons crucial over the long term in trying to expel Russia from occupied territory will not be ready in time for Kiev's imminent counteroffensive. The tank training got underway as the United States and its allies began to work out agreements to train Ukrainians on F-16 fighter jets and other long-sought advanced system. How is it advanced? Those aircraft would be part of a security plan to deter further attacks, U.S. Army General Mark Milley said late Thursday as he arrived in France. Everyone recognizes Ukraine needs a modernized Air Force because their existing Air Force does not exist anymore. And it's going to take considerable amount of time, which is what I've been saying all along. This takes years to do properly. If you try to accelerate it, you're just going to throw equipment on the battlefield that's going to get destroyed without achieving much. So this is possibly the growing realization in Washington of how unrealistic it was to just throw money at this problem. That you actually have to have a military-industrial output comparable to your adversary, or you're going to lose a war of attrition, which is exactly what's happening. The way they word this makes it sound as if they're going to send the F-16s after the conflict is over to give Ukraine an air force ahead of the next conflict. That's the way it sounds like to me. If they send the F-16s and the M1 Abrams anytime before that, they're just going to get destroyed like everything else the U.S. and its allies have sent Ukraine, and everything else Ukraine had on hand from February 2022 onward to begin with. I think that this talk about F-16s, the talk about tanks, I've said this many times before, it's in a way a bluff. Not in the sense that they're not going to send them. Of course they're going to send these weapon systems. The bluff comes in the form of making it appear that there is limitless support going to Ukraine. The West will never give up on Ukraine, so Russia should give up first. And it's clear that that is a bluff. Russia is calling them on their bluff, and they don't know what else to do, so they're just going to continue doing this for now, which is exactly what they did in Vietnam for many years, and it's what they did in Afghanistan for 2 decades. It's what they're doing right now in Syria. They're in an unsustainable situation that they cannot win. They don't want to admit that they lost, so they just keep kicking the can down the road until some undefined point in time where it will be less damaging for them to withdraw. So we have to keep an eye on all of this. The offensive is going to come sooner or later. It's going to come, just like last year, the fall offensive. That was supposed to be a spring offensive, then a summer offensive. Eventually it was launched in the fall. I believe this offensive will be launched. I am not even going to speculate how it will go. There are tens of thousands of troops that have been trained. They've kept a lot of their best equipment reserved for this offensive. It would be very hard to concentrate that much manpower and equipment on just a few points along the line of contact and not make a little bit of progress. If you look at Russian defenses, they're layered, they're deliberately designed to give ground to Ukraine so that they can fall back and destroy Ukrainian forces in the process. That's what they did during the Kharkov and Kherson offensives last year. That is what they've got planned for Ukraine this year. Again, we'll just keep an eye on it. Right now, obviously, if the offensive starts, I'm going to be covering it very closely. Until then, I might not do that many updates on Ukraine. If you want a daily update on Ukraine, I highly suggest the Duran, both Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikhouras, do daily videos on their respective channels covering Ukraine and everything about it, everything from battles on the line of contact to the larger geopolitical context. They also will do videos together throughout the week talking about Ukraine and many other related topics. I highly recommend them. The links to their channels will be in the video description below. In the meantime, I'm going to also be covering a lot of what's going on here in Asia. The US is doing here in Asia what they have already done in Europe. It's very important to cover both of these areas because they're directly related. Those links will be in the video description below. All of the links that I referenced in this video will be in the video description below. All different ways you can find and follow my work elsewhere will be there, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it because it's not helping me out at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out month to month or through one-time donations, thank you so much. I also greatly appreciate people who simply share my work with others. That is greatly appreciated. All of this is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.